In this video, we're going to be talking about the elements of poetry. So, poetry is a type of literature or artistic writing that attempts to stir a reader's imagination or emotions. And the way that the poet does this is by choosing words that are going to have a specific connection, trying to choose figurative language that's going to convey a certain imagery for the reader in order to get across their ideas. With that in mind, in this video, we're going to be talking about these 8 things: poetry versus prose versus drama, stanzas, lines, repetition, imagery, rhyme scheme, free verse, and alliteration. To start us off, let's talk about the 3 types of writing: poetry, prose, and drama. When we're talking about poetry, remember it's meant to kind of create or stir the imagination of the reader to make an emotional connection. It's oftentimes shorter. You're going to have more rhyme scheme in it. Sometimes it's going to be fantastical, like this poem that we have here by Shel Silverstein titled Invitation. If you are a dreamer, come in. If you are a dreamer, a wisher, a liar, a hoper, a prayer, a magic bean buyer, if you're a pretender, come sit by my fire, for we have some flax golden tales to spin. Come in, come in. And that very short poem is meant to be inviting, that regardless of who you are and what you're doing, I want you to share stories with me. That's the idea it's trying to convey, and it does that in a very short, imaginative way. Next, we have prose, and prose is just narrative writing. It's like when you're reading a book or an article. And this example is from the book A Wrinkle in Time. And you can see it's like a lot of narratives you read, a lot of books you've read. It was a dark and stormy night. In her attic bedroom, Margaret Murray, wrapped in an old patchwork quilt, sat on the foot of her bed and watched the trees tossing in the frenzy and lashing of the wind. It's descriptive, it can be imaginative, but it's one that doesn't have rhyme scheme in it. It's one that isn't in a specific pattern. It's a story that you're telling. And that's what we mean about prose. It's narrative writing. The last type of writing we want to briefly touch on is dramatic writing, drama. And this is a play or a movie script, and you can see from this example here that it's taken from the first movie, The Avengers. This is from the Avengers movie script when we first see Tony Stark show up, and they describe it at the beginning, kind of what he's doing, and then they go into his dialogue. You'll notice this is a lot different than poetry, where poetry is shorter, it has rhyme schemes, stanzas. This doesn't have that. It's also very different than prose, which is narrative writing. It's not set up into really structured paragraphs. It's really just, this is what's happening and here's what the characters are saying. It's not going into this flowery language. It's not going into a lot of description. It leaves that up to the director and the actors to kind of fill those things in. So when we're thinking about writing, you want to make sure you understand the difference. There's poetry, there's prose, and drama. And in the rest of this video, we're going to be talking about poetry. The first thing we want to know about poetry is what a line is. And basically, it's just a specific row in the poem. It's really straightforward. For example, in this poem Where the Sidewalk Ends by Shel Silverstein, the first line is, there is a place where the sidewalk ends. That's line number 1. If I were to say, look on line number 3, you'd say, and there the grass grows soft and white. That's line number 3. They're numerical, they go in order, and that's what we're talking about when we're talking about a line. So next we have stanzas, and stanzas are basically paragraphs in poetry. It's when you have 4 or more lines together, and they form a block. Just like when you have a bunch of sentences, they form a paragraph. When you have 4 or more lines together, generally they form a stanza. If it's less than that, then we oftentimes refer to them just as lines and not as stanzas. So let's take a look again at the poem Where the Sidewalk Ends. Our first stanza is, there is a place where the sidewalk ends and before the street begins. And there the grass grows soft and white, and there the sun burns crimson bright, and there the moonbird rests from his flight to cool in the peppermint wind. That's a bunch of lines together that form a paragraph. In poetry, they form a stanza. The next stanza is the one right below it, and it's the next 6 lines. And then after that, it's the next 4 lines is the third stanza. And so when we're referring to a poem, if I refer to stanza 3 or stanza 5, you'll know that it's like the 3rd paragraph in that poem, it's the 5th paragraph in that poem, respectively. Next we have repetition, and repetition is just repeating words, or phrases, or lines, or stanzas. And in poetry, just like it is in other writing, You repeat things in order to emphasize a certain feeling or idea. Sometimes in poetry it does create a rhythm, and it can also show like a sense of urgency, depending on what that poem is. So let's take a look at the poem Annabel Lee by Edgar Allan Poe as an example of repetition. Now this isn't the whole poem, it's just an excerpt. But let's take a look at the first three stanzas. It was many and many a year ago in a kingdom by the sea, that a maiden there lived whom you may know by the name of Annabel Lee. And this maiden she lived with no other thought than to love and be loved by me. I was a child and she was a child in this kingdom by the sea, but we loved with a love that was more than love, I and my Annabel Lee, with a love that the winged seraphs of heaven coveted her and me. And this was the reason that long ago in this kingdom by the sea, a wind blew out of a cloud, chilling my beautiful Annabel Lee, so that her high-born kinsman came and bore her away from me, to shut her up in a sepulchre in this kingdom by the sea. And now hopefully you've noticed a couple of different types of repetition. In the first two stanzas, you really have the word love repeated over and over again to kind of emphasize just how deep their love for each other was, how much he cared for her, how much he saw her as part of himself, that love was great. And then throughout all three stanzas, you keep getting this repetition of in a kingdom by the sea. And at first it's kind of like, oh, that's where it's taking place. But the more he says it, in a kingdom by the sea, in a kingdom by the sea, in this kingdom by the sea, it almost becomes more sad or almost kind of menacing the way that they keep repeating it again and again and again. And so we can see how repetition works in many different ways. It can emphasize something good. It can emphasize something bad. But it's there to kind of grab our attention. The next element of poetry we want to talk about is imagery. And if you haven't gone and watched the video on figurative language, you really want to make sure you've done that. Otherwise, this might not make a lot of sense, because imagery uses a lot of figurative language in order to create images in our head and our minds to help better understand what's going on so that we can really see it, or we can really understand what it might be to touch or to taste whatever it is that the poet is describing. Now, let's take a look at this poem as an example of imagery. If only I could catch my dreams and keep them in a jar, I'd watch them dance like fireflies, flickering like stars. They would grow and I'd let them go to see how far they'd fly, lighting up the pitch black night as they soar throughout the sky. And I think this is some very visual, vivid imagery. It doesn't necessarily connect to taste or to touch, but it's definitely very visual. And if you've ever been outside, and especially in the Midwest, this happens a lot, we have fireflies. If you've ever caught them in a jar and then let them go, this is something you can relate to. And by connecting it to dreams, by making that metaphor, you're able to better understand how we do hold on to dreams, but how it's important to let them go, to spread, to not just keep them inside, but to try to see how far they will go, how far our dreams will take us. Just like letting go of these fireflies and seeing how far they will go. Making that comparison, making that connection, but in a way that we can very much visualize, that we can see. And next we have rhyme scheme. And rhyme scheme is the pattern of rhyme that comes at the end of a line of poetry. And we mark them with letters generally. And so they might be rhyme schemes such as ABAB or AABB. Those are two examples of rhyme schemes. Let's take a look at the first stanza in the poem Two Roads Diverged in a Yellow Wood by Robert Frost as an example. And as I'm reading this, what I want you to do is kind of go through and see what you would label the rhyme scheme. Remember, it's the last word in each line, and you're seeing if it rhymes with any other words at the end of any other lines. Okay? Let's take a look at it. Two roads diverged in a yellow wood, and sorry I could not travel both, and be one traveler long I stood, and looked down one as far as I could to where it bent in the undergrowth. Now what you want to do is just take a second and think about what you would label this. Is this AABB? Is it AABBA? ABC? What do you think the rhyme scheme is going to be? Now, the rhyme scheme for this stanza is going to be ABAAB. And that's because if you take a look at the last word in that first line, wood, it doesn't rhyme with both, which is the last word in the next line. So that first one would be A, that second one would be B, because they don't rhyme together. But then stood and would, oh, those two rhyme, so that's another A rhyme. Could, stood, would, that rhymes as well, so that's another A. Growth doesn't rhyme with wood, but does rhyme with both, so that would be B, giving us our rhyme scheme A, B, A, A, B. Next we have free verse, and that's basically when a poem does not have a specific rhyme scheme. There may be like one rhyme in there, but there's really not any at all. And so when you're talking about poems, often there's a rhyme scheme or there's free verse, or sometimes there's a mix of the two, where some lines rhyme and others don't. It's really kind of comes down to what's the majority of it. If it's mostly rhyming, then there's going to be a kind of a rhyme scheme. If it doesn't rhyme, then it's going to be free verse. For example, in these first two stanzas of Song of the Open Road by Walt Whitman, it's free verse. There's no rhyme scheme. Afoot and light-hearted I take to the open road, healthy, free, the world before me, the long brown path before me, leading wherever I choose. Henceforth I ask not good fortune, I myself am good fortune. Henceforth I whimper no more, postpone no more, need nothing. Done with indoor complaints, libraries, querulous criticisms, strong and content I travel the open road. You'll notice that the only rhyme in there is, it's not really a rhyme, but he used the word road twice. Otherwise, there's no rhyme scheme at all, so this is going to be free verse. But let's take a look at one of the poems we read earlier, the one about dreams and fireflies. And you'll notice that there's a rhyme scheme to it, but it's not every line is going to have a rhyme. So dreams and jar don't rhyme, fireflies and stars don't rhyme, dreams and fireflies don't rhyme, but jar and stars do. So in that first part, it's A, B, C, B. And then you have, they would grow and let them go. To see how far they'd fly. Go and fly don't rhyme. Go and night don't rhyme, but fly and sky do. So you have D, E, F, E. So for the whole poem, our rhyme scheme would be A, B, C, B, D, E, F, E. And I would still say this as a rhyme scheme. There is, again, some verses that don't rhyme, but that's okay. It's when they mostly don't rhyme, or the vast majority of it isn't a rhyme, where it's going to be free verse. Otherwise, it's going to have a rhyme scheme. The final thing we're going to talk about in this video is alliteration. And that's the occurrence of the same consonant, letter, or sound at the beginning of adjacent or closely connected words. And it kind of creates rhythm where there might not actually be any. It makes it sound lyrical, kind of sing-song-like, to have those sounds very close together. When this happens with vowel sounds, we call it assonance, but generally we see it with alliteration with consonant sounds. So as an example of alliteration, I'm going to read this nursery rhyme and hopefully not mess it up. Let's take a look at it. Betty Botter bought some butter, but she said the butter's bitter. If I put it in my batter, it will make my batter bitter. But a bit of better butter will make my batter better. So she bought some better butter, better than the bitter butter, and she put it in her batter, and her batter was not bitter. So 'twas better Betty Botter bought a bit of better butter. And you'll notice that it kind of creates that sing-songy lyrical thing, even though it's not a song. But all of that repetition of that same sound, that alliteration, gives it that quality. And this is an extreme example. A lot of alliteration isn't necessarily this much, but this is what it can be, and this is what it does look like. So overall, you just want to kind of keep in mind that poetry is different than prose, is different than dramatic writing, that when we're talking about poetry, we're talking about writing that's often shorter, that rhymes, that has a lot of imagery in it, that's meant to connect to your emotions and maybe to specific ideas, and that those poems are made up of lines and stanzas, repetition, imagery, rhyme scheme, or free verse, and that alliteration is used as well to kind of create a lyrical quality. If you have any questions or are confused by this, please watch this video again, or you can take a look at this on the class dictionary, or you can always ask me as well. Thank you.